How do I look? Like someone trying too hard? How about you relax a bit? You think so? Is this better? Barely. Arthur gave an awkward chuckle when he was told he was putting on too much of a front. He was holding both of his new weapons and striking an overly gallant pose. Mary stood nearby, and Roland could sense the animosity radiating from her eyes. While the others kept quiet, he had no problem speaking to Arthur plainly now. He didn't see himself as one of Arthur's retainers, but more like a partner in crime. Just as Roland had to worry about appearances to a certain degree, Arthur was facing a different kind of pressure. He was one of the heir candidates who had not yet earned true acceptance from the others. They all knew that if his brothers noticed any flaw in his behavior or appearance, they would likely cause a scene. Roland could only imagine how much stress his friend was under, but there wasn't much he could do besides playing the role of the perfect High Knight commander. Don't get discouraged, Lord Arthur. You look quite gallant and fashionable. I'm sure all the other nobles will be green with envy. While Roland shared his honest opinion, Mary chose to compliment Arthur on his dramatic posing. He was clearly overdoing it, but that did not mean he looked bad. His long white hair matched the polished richness of his attire, which had been crafted with both tradition and extravagance in mind. Arthur stood confidently, dressed in a refined outfit that reflected his natural sense of style. His black coat, trimmed with silver patterns inspired by the Valyrian crest, was elegant without being excessive. Beneath it, he wore a dark green vest and a crisp high-collared shirt, the deep green drawing attention to his eyes. His long, silvery white hair was neatly brushed and draped over his shoulders, deliberately concealing the tips of his ears. How do they feel? Is there a problem with channeling your aura? Mary focused on complimenting Arthur, but Roland remained focused on the task at hand. They were nearly out of time, and it was time to leave. The new blades Arthur held were still prototypes, but by the look of things, they were a success. These are quite astonishing. I just wish I could practice more. Of all the things I thought I would lack, time was not one of them. Arthur held one of the rapiers in his right hand and gave it a quick flourish. With his current Tier 3 class, he had reached superhuman status. The speed at which he moved the blades would appear as a blur to most observers, even those who had also reached Tier 3. In the past, he had given up on the idea of advancing this far and believed he would eventually fade into obscurity. Now, however, it felt as if there was too much to do, and not nearly enough time to do it. Unfortunately, we don't have time. Once we're back, I'm sure you can take Mary and finally explore the dungeon properly. I could even prepare a proper suit of armor for you and some of your guards. Roland said as he moved toward the door, clearly urging them to leave. That would be splendid, my friend. Arthur replied with a cheerful tone, then turned to his maid. Ah, yes, we did have that agreement, didn't we, Mary? I suppose you won't have any excuses left now. Yes, Lord Arthur. Mary replied with a tone of resignation while Arthur smiled. The young lord had longed to explore the dungeon and experience a true adventure. For years, he had been confined to training with bound monsters, striking them repeatedly just to raise his skills. He had promised not to face real danger until he reached his current level, and now that the time had come, he was ready to train seriously and explore in earnest. A noble had many duties and experiences to face, and venturing into deadly dungeons to face monstrous creatures was one of his next goals. But before that journey could begin, they all had to tackle the next challenge. It might be a minor step forward, or it might prove to be a mountain waiting to be climbed. They wouldn't be sure until they arrived at the city of Isgard. Shall we? Roland asked as he pushed the door open. Arthur nodded. Indeed. Behind the door stood two armored men in full suits of armor. Their visors were lowered, and both saluted their lord before taking their positions behind him. Roland remained at the front as he led the group forward and was the first to step through the exit of the mansion. Only after he had stepped outside and given a nod did Arthur emerge, where everyone was already waiting for his departure. Outside, many servants stood in silence. The maids and butlers were present with their heads bowed. In front of them stood a large carriage prepared specifically for this mission. It was a gleaming testament to noble wealth and enchanted craftsmanship. Its body was painted a pristine white with a subtle sheen, accented by golden highlights that caught the early morning light. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than an overly expensive carriage drawn by 4 white steeds. However, it had been constructed from costly alloys, and multiple runic enchantments were hidden beneath the chassis. Though it looked like a normal, lavish carriage, it held a few surprises. I wish we could have spent that money elsewhere. Arthur muttered as he looked at the extravagant carriage in front of him. Roland knew exactly how much it had cost to build and had personally modified the original schematics to fit more runic enchantments. For the price of this single carriage, they could have likely created several battle golems, which made the whole thing feel like a waste. Even so, they had to maintain appearances. Without it, Arthur's brothers would certainly mock his arrival. "We can dismantle it for parts once we're back," Roland whispered to Arthur as the two made their way toward the carriage. He would not be riding inside with his friend. Instead, he had been assigned to a horse positioned just in front of it. While the 4 horses pulling the carriage were all snow white, the stallion given to Roland was pitch black. He wasn't wearing his usual heavy armor, but he still looked unmistakably like a noble knight. His cape fluttered as he mounted the steed, which was covered in heavy runic barding, and he glanced back toward his supposed lord. Mary was the only one permitted to sit inside the carriage, her status as the chief maid granting her that privilege. She opened the door and waited for Arthur to enter first, then followed him inside. His voice echoed from within the carriage shortly afterward. "Let us depart then." The entourage of around 60 well-equipped soldiers and knights began to move. Morian and Gareth, the 2 knights who had waited patiently outside Arthur's private quarters, now rode behind the carriage, flanking it on either side. As the company descended from the estate's elevated position and entered the first tier of the city, Roland couldn't help but feel a strange tug at the edge of his thoughts. They hadn't even reached the city square yet, but the streets were already lined with people. Cheering people, which in itself was odd. The announcement had been made to clear the streets for Arthur, who was preparing to leave. This was not meant to be a triumphant event or an opportunity to gain more favor with the people. They were simply departing toward the current main city teleportation gate. Originally, they had planned to build the gate within the range of the barracks, considering it was primarily a military asset. However, after they began harvesting mana fluid before the culling event, they amassed such an immense amount of funds that they were able to construct 2 gates. The one they were heading to stood in the center of the city, closed to the public, but the one that had been finished. It appeared that the people of Albrook held genuine affection for their noble lord. The soldiers wore awkward smiles as the commoners cheered, a clear sign of how well the city was being governed. Roland, who had anticipated some hostility due to the extensive monitoring system, was somewhat surprised. Yet it seemed that as long as the citizens were fed, clothed, and sheltered, they asked for little else. At least for the time being. "I'm not sure it will stay that simple forever." Roland had the modern world to reflect on. The inventions he had once taken for granted were considered luxuries in this one, accessible only to kings and high nobles. He understood that as they continued to develop their lands, people would begin to expect the technological comforts they were introducing, such as constant hot water and a functioning sewer system. This shift meant that maintaining public approval would become increasingly expensive. They would have to preserve the runic devices that were quickly becoming standard. To do that, they needed either to reach new heights on their own or to secure the full support of Duke Alexander Valerian, the ruling authority of the region. Their visit to the noble gathering was not only a chance to display Arthur's rising power and status. It was also a critical opportunity to forge alliances and build connections. They were in dire need of new sources of income, because the mana fluid harvested from the dungeon would eventually run out. Without fresh means of funding, sustaining their growth would become difficult. "Even those elemental metals won't be enough, the more we push onto the market, the lower their value will become," he continued thinking to himself as his horse trotted forward. For some reason, many of the waves from the crowd seemed directed at him. He could only assume it was because he was riding in front of the carriage, receiving the attention meant for Arthur, who outwardly appeared to be the mastermind behind their operation. Even so, when he passed by groups of people, many turned their heads and kept watching the man on the dark stallion. Roland paused in thought, then awkwardly raised his hand and began waving back. By now, he understood the value of acknowledging the people who lived under his rule. Cheers broke out as the elusive High Knight commander returned the crowd's greeting, and so they continued on their way toward the gate that would lead them to Isgard. The gate's grounds were still under construction. Only the foundation and the first 2 levels of the tower that would house it had been completed. In the future, it was set to become a major travel point and possibly a location the Mage Guild would make use of. While they could not force the mages to establish a branch in Albrook, they hoped to attract them with promises of research funding. The nearby dungeon filled with Tier 3 monsters was an enticing bonus that few mages would ignore. "Wayland, don't worry, I'll keep everyone safe while you're gone." As they neared the unfinished tower, Roland saw a muscular man shouting at him from a distance. Beside him stood a smaller half-elf who immediately smacked the back of his head, prompting an argument between the two. When Roland saw this familiar pair, he couldn't help but smile. Normally, the idea of leaving Albrook and his wife behind would have made him nervous. But now, he had more allies than ever, people he could truly rely on. Hey, don't turn your head away. Nevertheless, he chose not to react to his brother-in-law's antics and simply continued toward the building ahead. The gate was already beginning to activate. It was much larger than the one he had in his own workshop, large enough to accommodate Arthur's carriage along with the soldiers accompanying him. As the last of the troops moved up the wide stone ramp toward the towering arch of the blue teleportation gate, the air around them shimmered with runic energy. Roland took one final look at the familiar skyline of Albrook, then passed through the gate. The familiar pull of the magic took hold instantly, and within moments, he found himself on the other side. His horse seemed slightly disoriented, but it had been trained for this kind of travel and continued forward without issue. He was now in Isgard, a city he had only visited briefly in the past as a stopping point. However, the area he now stood in was unfamiliar. Keep formation. Lord Valerian will be coming through soon. While maintaining the appearance of the perfect knight, Roland made sure his soldiers stayed in formation. They had arrived in a large open space without a ceiling, surrounded by tall stone walls. Along the top of the walls stood archers and various other guards, watching the newcomers carefully. Not much of a grand welcome. I expected as much. The city of Isgard was vast, many times larger than Albrook or any other city on the island. It was home to over 1 million residents from various races, with humans making up about 70% of the population. The people gathered around them did not all belong to House Valerian. Only a few appeared to have come specifically to greet Arthur, the Duke's son. The lack of a formal reception was no surprise. There was a clear reason for it. Arthur was a bastard. Roland's troops moved forward and spread out in a half-circle formation. The luxurious carriage began to pass through the gate, but Roland's attention was focused more on their surroundings than on the procession itself. They were clearly in a heavily controlled area, guarded not only by soldiers but also by advanced magical defenses. Several magical devices were pointed directly at them, similar to the enchanted weaponry Roland had seen in Aldbourne, though far more sophisticated. In addition to the usual enchanted ballista, he noticed mechanisms capable of launching magical flames toward their position. Even worse, the ground was rigged with traps that, if triggered, would incinerate the entire area. How dare they? Mary's voice rang out from inside the carriage once it had fully emerged through the gate. The surrounding crowd could not hear her, thanks to the sound-blocking enchantments inside, but Roland had a direct link to Arthur through his helmet. It's fine, Mary. We were expecting this. But Lord Arthur, this is a faux gate. They are treating us as enemies. Please calm yourself, Mary. It's not as if I can complain. Arthur tried to soothe her, but Roland remained fixated on the term she had used, faux gate. These were strategic magical gates designed to lure enemies into traps. They were often employed in castles or strongholds, where defenders would allow enemy forces to teleport through, only to rain magical destruction on them the moment they arrived. If necessary, the defenders could activate powerful traps that would annihilate everything in the targeted zone. To Roland, it was obvious that whoever had chosen to bring them through this particular gate was sending an obvious message. Arthur was not welcome. They could not be certain whether the one pulling the strings was the Duke himself or one of his children, but Roland suspected the latter. The Duke did not usually involve himself in the petty rivalries of his offspring. He let them handle matters on their own and would likely only step in if things became too violent. Greetings, Lord Arthur Valerian. I'm glad you arrived just in time. A man who looked like a butler greeted them. He offered the customary bow and spoke with the expected politeness, but there was a strange smirk on his face. His eyes were narrow, almost sly, giving him the appearance of a fox in the act of squinting. Then, just as Roland dismounted and was about to hand over his horse's reins to one of the servants, the man spoke again. It is unfortunate, but would the young lord kindly vacate the premises? The gate needs to be activated again. He bowed again, this time with a mock display of courtesy. It was clearly intended as an insult directed at Arthur. The meaning was not lost on the others either, as a few nearby servants and soldiers began to snicker. There was no longer any doubt that they weren't taken seriously. Roland wanted nothing more than to strike the man across the face, but he restrained himself. This could easily be a trap, and they still had no idea who this man really was. It was wiser to stay calm. They had entered the belly of the beast, and anything could happen. They aren't taking us seriously. The message is clear. Roland stood still, watching the soldiers surrounding them. His group numbered around 50, with 5 of them being Tier 3 class holders. Their opponents had twice the number of troops, but among them there was only one person at Tier 3. Still, they possessed a variety of enchanted weapons, and the traps set up around this fake gate could not be dismissed. Do they not care, or was the deception successful? The entire city of Albrook was under surveillance through his monitoring devices. Whenever someone passed through the main gate, their mana fingerprint and level were recorded. Even if they wore enchanted items to conceal their status, his runic devices could uncover the truth. This method had exposed numerous spies. Some were eliminated, while others were handled by the maids using various methods before being released with false information. That might have explained today's treatment, although simple disdain for Arthur's presence could also be a contributing factor. You dare take that tone with Lord Arthur Valerian? Regardless of the reason, Roland had to act. As the second in command, he could not allow this insult to Arthur to pass unanswered. It was a direct challenge. As High Knight Commander, it was his duty to respond. He stepped forward toward the man who had asked them to clear the area, ready to deliver a few carefully chosen words. Roland strode toward the fox-eyed man. Although he wore lighter armor than usual, he still towered over the seemingly unassuming butler. To most people here, the man likely appeared harmless, but Roland could see through the act. He was similar to Mary, a hidden Tier 3 assassin. Without a doubt, he was the strongest person present and likely had a method of escape prepared in case the traps were triggered. The fox-eyed man's smile remained, but his posture tensed. He was no fool as he could feel the shift in atmosphere, the invisible weight of killing intent pressing in from Roland's every step. The knights behind Arthur instinctively tightened their formation, eyes shifting between the gate's defenders and their commander. Now, the butler said with a practiced chuckle, lifting one gloved hand as if to wave away Roland's fury like a puff of smoke. There is no need for such words. This is just a simple matter of logistics. I'm sure the young lord will understand. Silence. Show some respect. Roland's voice turned colder, infused with his intimidation skill. The Tier 2 soldiers surrounding them began to feel the pressure bearing down on them, and even the defensive enchantments on their armor struggled to shield them. Though clearly affected, none of them collapsed, but the man standing before Roland remained unmoved. His smile did not fade, in fact, it grew wider. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, as though the entire encounter had been a ruse to observe Arthur's response. Nevertheless, this was something the two had discussed beforehand. Roland raised his hand, and runes began activating, not on his armor but on the massive sword carried by the horse. The large metal holster holding it in place started hissing, and the weapon slowly started to slide out of it. The sudden movement caused the guards and even the fox-like man to tense. The magical energy radiating from the sword was intense, strong enough that none of them could ignore it. But before the situation could escalate, a voice called out from within the carriage. Sir Wayland, that's enough. Stand down. It was Arthur, speaking calmly to defuse the tension just as they had practiced during their planning sessions. The young lord didn't want to leave anything to chance, so they had prepared for several possible outcomes. One scenario resembled this exact moment, and they had agreed that Roland would display a controlled show of force before Arthur stepped in to de-escalate the situation. The fox-eyed man's smile twitched, only slightly, but Roland noticed it. That flicker of uncertainty was all he needed to confirm the bluff had worked. The butler had probably not expected any pushback to come from someone like Arthur. The sheer fact that he was able to control someone like High Commander Wayland already showed that he had his loyalty. These nobles thought Arthur was soft, but now perhaps they would think otherwise. As you command, Lord Arthur. Roland held his ground for a moment longer, letting the silence settle around them. The massive rune sword, which had only halfway left its holster, began to slide back in on its own. The silence was intentional. He wanted to show them that they would not allow themselves to be pushed around. The pace at which they handled matters was theirs to set, and for now, their plan appeared to be working. I hope you're not planning to let my lord step out in this place. Although this part of the operation was finished, the battle itself was far from over. Roland stepped toward the butler, and the carriage began to move. Once it cleared the teleportation gate ramp, the fox-eyed man gave a nod and bowed. He then looked to the side, and a new gate slowly began to open, revealing a path ahead. Of course, Sir Wayland. Allow me to guide you to your temporary accommodations. Temporary accommodations? Isn't the Grand Assembly taking place today? The man paused and looked up, still wearing a broad smile. Roland already had a sense of what was happening but chose to press further. No, good sir. The assembly will take place in 2 days. Some of our guests are scheduled to arrive later. Roland said nothing. This was another layer of mockery built into the event. They had been given an official date and time for the assembly, yet the schedule for using the gates varied for each brother and noble. This manipulation served to establish a hierarchy. Those forced to arrive early and wait in temporary guest houses were viewed as lesser. Since Arthur had arrived 2 days in advance, he ranked somewhere in the middle. Some nobles had been summoned even earlier. The other sons of Duke Valerian clearly didn't intend to let Arthur gain any standing without a fight. And they'd started that fight before the real gathering had even begun. Still, this was not a loss. Their arrival had already challenged assumptions. The fox-eyed butler's momentary hesitation was proof of that. Word of this encounter would spread. Rumors moved faster than banners, and Arthur's growing strength would be measured by how he endured this trial of politics. This was what I was trying to run from, but I got pulled back in anyway. Roland climbed back onto his horse and they began moving. When he was younger, he had escaped his old home to distance himself from noble politics. Even though he had memories from his old life which made him an adult, he had still been naive. This kingdom and likely the entire world was controlled by people like these nobles. There was no real escape from it. The only way forward was to gain power of his own or align with factions strong enough to shield him when he lacked the strength himself. I hope it ends at this. I should probably take it easy. If I posture too much they might actually ask me for a duel. While Roland didn't fear the other knight commanders, he had not worn his best armor to this event. He understood that if he acted too aggressively, some knights might take offense and challenge him to a duel. Such confrontations had occurred in the past, and he couldn't ignore the possibility that one of Arthur's brothers might seize this chance to test his strength. Wayland, the High Knight Commander, had become the subject of many rumors, and this gathering presented a valuable opportunity to uncover some of his secrets. As they passed through the gate, more of the fortress's interior came into view. They were now in Isgard, the largest city on this volcanic island and one located near the supervolcano dungeon. From this vantage point, however, the volcano was not visible. A powerful magical barrier blocked the sight of it and replaced the landscape with a scene that resembled a typical skyline. They had arrived directly inside the massive castle fortress built by the Valerian household, a self-contained city that stood in stark contrast to the lands beyond its walls. There is a massive environmental control formation around this entire castle. He had noticed it earlier, but the temperature here was surprisingly mild. He had visited this city before, and back then the heat from the volcano had been ever present, seeping into every corner. The entire castle radiated with magical energy, a force that prevented the volcanic warmth from penetrating the interior. Even in the event of an eruption, the lava and ash likely would not breach the magical defenses. Interesting. I should analyze it. This barrier appears more advanced than any I encountered at the Institute. The area they had access to was closed off from the outside. It was clear that only the wealthy lived in this part of the castle, as there were no commoners or adventurers in sight. Their group continued forward, and Roland took a moment to assess their surroundings. Under normal circumstances, he would have deployed his sensors and flotation golems to scan the area, but that was not an option now. Any such action, if discovered, would put both Arthur and himself at risk. There was also the strong possibility that detection devices or surveillance magic more advanced than his own were present. The Duke was known to be a Tier 4 class holder, a level of power Roland had not yet attained. Thus he just used his eyes and senses that were available to him. To his knowledge, the Grand Castle was divided into 3 distinct areas. The first, the outer castle area consisted of servants' quarters, training grounds, and infrastructure that supported the daily function of the stronghold. It also acted as the first defensive barrier and from what he knew, took quite a bit of damage from the recent culling event. The third, the inner heart of the castle, was reserved for the highest nobility, including Duke Valerian himself. It was there that the most powerful enchantments were anchored and where the family's most sacred relics were kept. However, Roland and the others had not been granted entry to it, for that they would need to wait until every guest arrived and the entrance would be open for everyone. They had been placed in the middle section instead. This area was known for its peace and leisure, something every noble hoped to experience at least once. After moving away from the area with the teleportation gate, they arrived in a vast courtyard paved with marble and surrounded by opulent manors. For a moment, he wondered if he had been transported to another magical institute, as towering spires rose around him, carved from enchanted obsidian and glowing moonstone. This part of the city was home only to nobility, their personal servants, and a handful of exceptionally wealthy merchants. The area stretched wide and reminded him of green suburbs from the modern world. There were few shops here, as this place served purely as a secluded residential paradise, carefully planned to offer both luxury and tranquility to the kingdom's most powerful families. Most of the permanent residents were aging heads of noble houses. Many had relinquished their titles and chosen to retire here rather than remain on their ancestral lands. Some of the mansions were occupied by mistresses installed by high-ranking nobles, waiting to be visited for a few fleeting days before being left alone again for months. Similar areas existed in several other ducal cities as well as the largest one in the capital. Although these districts appeared to be lavish paradises on the surface, they served a deeper purpose. They acted as a means to bind the lesser noble families to the high nobility. Some believed the residents here were not much different from hostages. They were rarely permitted to leave and could only access select districts within the outer castle grounds, which included various businesses and an exclusive pleasure district reserved for the wealthy. Is something wrong? No, everything is fine. Let's just continue and get this over with. As they passed through the area, he could tell Arthur's heartbeat was quickening. The nervousness was becoming more obvious. Arthur kept shifting in his seat, restlessly glancing out of the small carriage windows. From what he knew, this was where Arthur's mother had once been kept, though he wasn't sure if she still lived there. This doesn't really look like the area from Arthur's Ascension trial. She might be held somewhere else. The memory capture device allowed Roland to peer into Arthur's personal memories. The first zone appeared as a lavish mansion enclosed by an illusory dome that resembled the barrier currently hovering above them. Although similar, there were clear differences. In the distance, he could see the main inner region of the castle along with the massive wall surrounding it. This was certainly the main Isgard castle, not a hidden area concealed by illusion. There is something there, but I won't be sure unless I examine it more thoroughly, he thought while scanning a few suspicious locations. The obsidian spirals were not merely decorative. They emitted strange magical fluctuations that he felt compelled to investigate. Just as he began to strain his senses, he noticed the suspicious-looking butler watching him. The man smiled, as if he had realized what Roland was attempting, prompting Roland to halt his investigation, at least for now. To make things worse, people were starting to look at him as they moved through the flat road. They were all nobility, their gazes were mostly focused on the luxurious-looking carriage and the Valyrian crest on it. As the carriage finally pulled up to their designated temporary mansion, Roland couldn't help but scowl. It was impressive, on the surface. A tall white structure with silver-tiled roofs, flanked by trimmed hedges and small ornamental trees, it stood nestled just along the perimeter of the inner wall. The proximity to the wall said everything. This wasn't a place of honor. It was close enough to the servant area to mock them. Welcome to your residence, young lord. I do hope you find it comfortable. The message was clear. He had been placed in one of the mansions farthest from the inner castle area. This arrangement had clearly been prepared to send a message, though it was done in a way that did not openly display contempt. If they reacted without a proper excuse, they would risk becoming a laughingstock. However, Roland did not see this as entirely negative. The location was removed from the areas with heavier enchantments, suggesting that surveillance was not as intense. While there were no golemic cameras or sensors hidden here as there had been in Albrook, other magical devices capable of similar monitoring were still present. Roland dismounted with a sharp thud, his boots striking the stone path. He swept his gaze across the surroundings. More guards were stationed along the edges of the property, clearly positioned to keep watch over them. Subtle runic traps shimmered faintly among the flower beds. Wards lined the windows, likely placed to prevent anyone from sneaking out during the night. Only after he had scanned the area and given a nod did Gareth dismount his horse and open the door to Arthur's carriage. Arthur stepped out slowly, but his eyes did not focus on the temporary residence. Instead, they fixed on the Grand Isgard castle in the distance. The city was vast, and even though the inner wall lay several kilometers away, the towering structure still appeared enormous. Roland noticed the flicker of longing in Arthur's eyes but chose to remain silent. Instead, he turned his gaze to the same sight, taking in its grandeur. He could activate skills that allowed him to see the mana in the environment. Although the entire middle section pulsed with enchantments, it was insignificant compared to the massive column of radiant energy that surrounded the castle. This is going to be a headache. He already felt a faint pressure building in his skull just from being here, and it was clear this situation would only get worse. The power concentrated in this place was overwhelming, and they were now trapped. Leaving was no longer an option, and he knew he wouldn't be able to take control of the teleportation gates as easily as he had during his brother's rescue. They were stuck, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and watchful eyes. Any one of them could be a threat, and surviving the next 2 days would be a challenge. Arthur had already insulted one of his brothers, and the risk of assassination was very real. Then to make things worse, the butler looked at the 50 soldiers they brought along and then spoke out. Roland looked at the grinning man before him but gave no response to the statement. The soldiers around him also remained silent, waiting for the order. The men who had escorted them showed slight nervousness at the lack of reaction. Their numbers were limited, and only one of them held a Tier 3 class. Captain. Yes, High Knight Commander. Roland did not move. He simply spoke the word. The man he summoned appeared in front of him, wearing armor that set him apart from the rest of the soldiers. His gear marked him with the rank of Knight Captain. Take the soldiers to the outer district and wait for further instructions. Yes, sir. There was no surprise in this. From the moment they entered the district, it had been clear that Arthur's entourage would be reduced. Before arriving, they had been forced to choose who would accompany them. Roland had decided not to involve Robert and Lucille. Together with Whiskhard, they had remained behind to protect their newly acquired holdings in the region taken from Theodore Valerian and Albrook. This left Mary, Gareth, Warren, and Roland himself as the primary force responsible for Arthur's protection. The soldiers who accompanied them were intended for show only. They would remain stationed outside until the noble gathering concluded. There was a limit to how many individuals of their power could be positioned near Arthur, and while they could have brought a few more, only those who could be fully trusted were selected. Some Tier 3 knights were available, but they had chosen not to include them. Their prosthetic limbs would likely draw unwanted attention from the other nobles. Things should be more manageable with the 5 of us. To some, this number might seem small, but all were Tier 3 class holders, including Arthur. In Roland's view, escaping with a small group of elites would be far easier than managing a large contingent of soldiers. High-class fighters could unleash devastating attacks, and in a chaotic situation, having too many people nearby increased the risk of friendly fire and confusion. Very well, then. The mates will take care of your luggage. The butler bowed politely as the knight captain led the soldiers away, then spoke. His tone remained mostly the same, though it now carried a subtle hint of triumph. Just as he had said, the mansion where they were staying already had several servants assigned to them, which explained why they hadn't brought any of their own. It was clear that these people were affiliated with the Valerian household, but that did not mean they could be trusted. Roland did not move his head, but inside his helmet, his thoughts raced. Several people were watching them, some even hiding behind buildings or other structures. It was clear they were being observed, though he could not determine by whom. Perhaps they were hidden guards sent by the Duke for protection, or maybe spies working for one of Arthur's brothers, gathering information. There was also the unsettling possibility that someone more dangerous was involved. Regardless, his duty was clear. He had to monitor the situation and ensure Arthur arrived safely at the gathering in 2 days. There is no need. I have my own personal maid. Arthur said. There was no luggage in the traditional sense. All their belongings were stored in spatial containers, which were light and easy to carry. Nothing remained that required extra handling. As you wish, young lord. The butler replied, inclining his head. Should you find our staff lacking, do not hesitate to make a formal request. We are here to serve. His words were polite, but the tone was strange. The man's presentation revealed no obvious faults, so there was little they could do besides let him be. Arthur gave no further response. He simply gestured for Gareth and Warren to enter the residence while Mary lingered behind him. The butler's eyes lingered on them for a moment before he turned and rejoined the small group of guards who had accompanied him. I bet he's going to report to his master, whoever that may be. Roland spoke to Arthur as their group moved toward their temporary mansion. Although it was one of the smaller houses in the area, it still appeared spacious and luxurious. It had clearly been built for a high-ranking noble. Several maids stood in a line on one side of the path leading to the mansion and bowed as Roland passed by with Arthur walking behind him. On the other side, more servants waited, some of them likely cooks and others appearing to be stable hands who would take care of the carriage and horses. The young noble lord was flanked by 2 knights on each side while Mary guarded the rear. Everyone kept a close eye on the servants, treating them as potential threats, but for now, none of them seemed strong enough to be a real danger. "Welcome to Asgard, my lord." One of the maids stepped forward. She was much older than the others, probably close to 50. Though her face bore some wrinkles, she concealed her age well. Her uniform was slightly different from the rest, suggesting she was the head maid in charge of the mansion. Before she could continue the greeting, Roland raised his hand to stop her. He turned to Arthur and signaled for him to ask the question they had agreed on earlier. "Are there any servants left inside the mansion?" "No, my lord. All the servants have come out to greet you, my lord." "Good. High Knight Commander, if you would." "Yes, Lord Valerian." Roland nodded and pushed the door open. He then turned to the surprised head maid and said, "For the time being, no one is allowed to enter this mansion. Is that clear?" "Ah. Yes, sir." The maid understood and did not press for answers. It was clear that she had experience and knew better than to question a noble's decision. Confronting Arthur or his soldiers could easily lead to trouble, so the maid stepped aside and allowed Roland to enter. Once inside, he closed the large oaken door behind him and began scanning the room. "I'm getting some readings. Let's set up the cancellation barrier first." Without saying a word, he moved his hand over his chest plate. Ever since passing through the teleportation gate, he had been using his new skill to conceal some of his runes. Now that he was in a place without prying eyes, he activated them. The runes on his breastplate lit up, and a pulse of mana spread out in all directions, forming a grid of perfectly aligned squares. This was a basic scanning spell, designed to sweep through the entire mansion quickly. "As I thought, this whole place is filled with enchantments." It did not take a genius to realize that Arthur was being watched. There was likely a reason he had been assigned to this particular mansion, located near the outer district of the castle. Even before entering, he had noticed concealed magical threads running toward another district, likely where someone was monitoring them. Now then, let's just feed them some false information. Although Roland could have easily blocked the signal from escaping, that approach carried too much risk. If everything were suddenly cut off, it would raise suspicion. Whoever had installed these enchantments would immediately know something was wrong. It was far better to appear less capable and less aware. Feeding their enemies false information would create a false sense of security and lead them to lower their guard. When the time came, that overconfidence would give Roland the advantage they needed. "Let's get this over with. They'll grow suspicious if I stay here too long. First, I need to deal with the dummy enchantments." Roland quickly realized that their enemies were aware a rune specialist was among them. Various enchantments, not all written in the same magical language, had been placed throughout the mansion. Some were clearly meant to serve as decoys to obscure the real ones. He decided to disable the most obvious enchantments, since leaving them intact might make them appear careless or incompetent. Once the initial skin was complete, he summoned a few of his floating golems. They began sweeping through the rooms, identifying potential threats. For someone like Roland, who had studied monitoring magic extensively and had developed an entirely new system back in Albrook, what he encountered here was rather primitive. There were no visual spells meant to record them, only audio-based enchantments and presence detection spells similar to his own mapping devices. Is it that kind of spell? As he moved through the mansion, he discovered even the toilet had been bugged with enchantments. This particular spell appeared to create a replica of the building in another location, with phantoms mimicking the movements of anyone inside. Multiple enchantments had been placed at key positions, allowing someone elsewhere to watch these phantoms and listen in on their conversations. He had no idea why someone would go to such lengths, but he had prepared for this possibility. That should do it. His golems completed their sweep. Roland disabled the more obvious dummy enchantments along with a few of the difficult ones, though he intentionally left several untouched. This allowed whoever was watching to continue their surveillance, giving them no reason to grow suspicious. Once the cleanup was done, he activated a program that would feed pre-recorded conversations into the surveillance network. These recordings, created with Arthur before their arrival, were filled with routine discussions and generic dialogue. For the next 2 days, no one would notice that what they were hearing was artificial. At the end of the sweep, he identified what would serve as Arthur's private chamber. Inside, he placed a square box beneath the bed. It contained the stored pre-recorded dialogues and functioned as the central component of the runic formation he had just created. The 4 golems positioned throughout the mansion concealed themselves in strategic locations and activated a spell that allowed them to remain hidden from the servants. With everything in place, he finally returned to the entrance, where Arthur was waiting for the others. Everything is in order, Lord Valerian. Good. Finally, something is going right. Let us go in. They said nothing more as Gareth, Mary, and Warren rejoined them in the foyer. Roland gave each of them a quick nod. There was no need for words, they all understood the situation from his gestures alone. The maid led them on a tour of the house. Arthur remained cordial throughout, asking polite questions and occasionally offering a nod of approval. His behavior was deliberate. He wanted to present himself as a proper noble who would not allow emotion to cloud his judgment, even in the face of clear injustice. Others in his position might have lashed out at the servants, but he chose to leave them alone. Soon, Arthur was escorted to his quarters. He dismissed the servants, leaving only Roland and Mary in the room. His 2 knights stood outside to guard the entrance, just as they had in the past. "How is it?" Arthur asked. "Everything is under control. We can speak freely here." "Thank you, my friend. I'm not sure what I would ever do without your help." Arthur let his shoulders slump forward and released a long, heavy sigh. For a moment, he looked like a balloon slowly losing air, as if he might collapse under the weight of everything pressing down on him. Roland could see the strain in his posture and expression. The young lord was clearly under immense stress, but he was still holding himself together. "How is our situation?" "Around the same as we predicted. This place is heavily monitored. Someone clearly has an eye on you." Roland spoke to Arthur while moving to the large window in the bedchamber. Mary nodded and walked over to the window, pulling the curtains shut. "There are people watching us. At least 5 of them. Some are hidden on the rooftops, others behind trees, and a few near those strange spiral statues," Mary said as she narrowed her eyes. Her class specialized in assassinations and was equally skilled at detecting nearby assailants. Roland had noticed the same. Many eyes were on them from a distance, and their intentions remained unclear. "I see. This will be an interesting night." "It will. Only 2 days remain, so if anyone plans to strike, it will likely be tonight." They had arrived earlier this morning, and the assembly was scheduled to begin in 2 days. This left the attackers with only 2 nights to act. "Why tonight?" Arthur asked while glancing around the room. "Your brothers arrive tomorrow, along with other high nobles. If something happens to you tonight, their absence would provide them with an alibi." Roland replied, checking his jamming devices to ensure they were still active. "That does make sense, regretfully so. Now that they were here, instead of calming down, they could do nothing but worry. It was possible the people watching from outside were only sentries keeping an eye on everyone and that nothing would actually happen. Still, they could not leave their fate to chance. There were those with real reasons to get rid of them, and they needed to be prepared. We still have most of the day. What would you propose we do?" Arthur asked Roland, who replied quickly while walking toward the door. "They're probably going to keep watching us even after we leave, but there's no reason not to go outside and walk through the city. Wouldn't it seem strange if we just stayed here and did nothing?" Arthur nodded. "That's true. I never really had the chance to explore this city fully before, Father's guards never let me wander. Mary, what do you think?" After Roland spoke, Arthur turned to Mary. She had been in this city before and had apparently trained somewhere in the outer district. While Arthur had also lived here, he had been confined to a place with little freedom to move around. Mary hesitated for only a moment before answering. "It might be dangerous, my lord. How about you stay here and I'll check fur?" Before she could finish, Arthur chuckled and raised his hand. "Nice try, Mary, but I'm now a Tier 3 class holder just like you. Stop worrying about me. Now tell me what you really think." Mary frowned briefly but eventually conceded. "It would probably be wise to examine the area around the house and identify who is trailing us. If you are their true target, Lord Arthur, they will likely reveal themselves." Roland nodded in agreement. From his perspective, the obvious target was Arthur. Whoever was following them would likely continue doing so and eventually expose themselves in some way. While many tracking enchantments existed in the city, most were within the mansion rather than along the roads. This was not Albrook. There were many places without oversight, and he could easily lure their pursuers into one of those dead zones if necessary. "I don't think they'll attack us in public. There are other nobles with their own knights wandering around who have nothing to do with this situation. It might actually be safer outside than here." A decision was made soon after. They agreed to go outside for a short time and do some sightseeing. Although this was primarily a residential district, there were still a few places worth visiting. With so many wealthy merchants and nobles in the area, several shops offered expensive items and even magical devices. Roland, though already an established craftsman, knew there was always new magic to study and adapt for his own creations. There was little to prepare, as everything they needed was already on them. They spent a few minutes checking that everything was in order before heading outside. The head maid greeted them again, but after a brief exchange and a quick dismissal, their small party of 5 made their way into the city. This time, Roland took the rear while Mary led the group, as she was the one familiar with the area. Roland scanned their surroundings, the visor in his helmet glowing faintly as he worked to identify any new pursuers. As expected, there was movement behind them. Just act normally. Each member of the group wore a special runic accessory for communication. For Mary, it was a pair of newly enchanted earrings. Arthur wore a stylish breastpin that served the same purpose, and for the 2 other knights, it was their helmets. Now then, who are we dealing with here? Shadowy figures emerged in the distance. They moved well through the alleys and narrow spaces, skilled at concealment but still not as capable as the group they were following. They likely had no idea their movements were being tracked and their mana signatures recorded. Roland could not tell if they intended to attack, but if they did, he would be ready. Several figures slipped into the shadows, hiding from view. Not far from them, a group of 5 moved through the middle district of the castle. They appeared unaware of the hidden watchers, their attention fixed on landmarks such as the large fountain that depicted one of the former dukes who had once ruled the region. Although the observers remained concealed from the eyes of passing nobles and merchants, their intended targets were not fooled. Even now, their movements were clearly displayed on a small screen inside the helmet of the man standing at the rear. His mouth was hidden, but he was transmitting voice messages to the other 4. Every motion the hidden group made, no matter how subtle, was being tracked in real time. We have 4 on the left and 3 on the right. They're keeping their distance, but it's obvious we're the ones they're after. Roland said, trying not to act too unnatural. The others received the message through their devices, and the first to respond was Arthur. Are we sure they aren't just part of my father's guard? Similar people used to watch over my mother and me when we lived here. That's a possibility. Was there anything distinct about that particular group? Roland asked as he turned toward the large fountain. He looked down into the water and saw a surprising number of coins. It was clearly a place for the wealthy, not just because of the coins but because he spotted silver and even some gold coins within the water. Regretfully, no. They don't use any obvious symbols that would give them away. Mary replied. She was the only one besides Roland who could sense the presence of these people. She was also the only one here who had previously encountered the guards keeping Arthur's mother hostage. Whoever these people were, they weren't doing a very good job. Their presence had been noticeable ever since the group left the teleportation gate, and their numbers only seemed to grow, which exposed their presence even more. So we don't know if they're allies or not. That complicates things. If we attack people from the Duke's house, we could get into serious trouble, but it's yet to be seen if they turn hostile. Roland said, tossing a copper coin into the fountain. He watched it sink while Arthur stepped beside him. Let's just leave them alone for now. They might be here for our safety. Maybe father sent them. Roland didn't answer right away, but after a moment, he asked. Was he the kind of man to do something like that? Arthur hesitated, searching his memory before finally responding. Not really. Father never seemed to care much. Maybe if it were one of my older brothers. The Duke had always been a strict and distant figure, much like Roland's own father. It was possible that Arthur's recent notoriety had caught his attention and that he was beginning to take his son's life more seriously. Still, they couldn't be sure. For now, let's just act normal. Are there any places we can visit without drawing too much attention? Mary thought for a moment, glancing around at the shops and carefully watching the faces of passing nobles. There's a tea house near the western edge of the middle district. It's popular with younger nobles and is known to be neutral ground. No house banners, no guards inside. People go there to gossip, so it's full of ears, but relatively safe from open conflict. Arthur nodded, clearly interested. Sounds perfect. Let's head there. Roland. Roland gave a small shrug. Sounds fine to me. I don't think they'll try anything in the middle of the day, but stay vigilant. The group adjusted their course, blending in with several noble entourages heading in the same general direction. As they walked, Roland noticed that their hidden followers had split up. Some moved ahead, while others lingered behind. They might have been trying to set up a trap somewhere up ahead, but more likely, they were repositioning to find better spots to listen in on the group's conversations. The tea house came into view a few minutes later. It was a 4-story building made of pale blue stone with a wide veranda on the ground floor. Delicate wind chimes hung from the corners of the roof, softly ringing as the breeze passed through. The tea house's name, Blue Petal Mansion, sounded grand, but considering the size of the building, it felt appropriate. It was clear that every noble and wealthy merchant would be given a private space inside. Mary stepped forward first and was greeted by the doorman, who bowed before them. She made sure there was no immediate threat, and they were soon guided inside. Just beyond the decorative entrance, a young woman in a violet uniform was already waiting. She had the refined appearance of a high-class maid and was quite attractive. She bowed deeply and addressed Arthur directly, paying no attention to the others. "Welcome to the Blue Petal Mansion, honored lord. May I prepare a private area for you, or would you prefer to sit in the open hall?" Arthur did not smile. He simply nodded. "A private room, if one is available. Nothing too secluded. A view from a window would be appreciated." "Of course, my lord. This way, please." The maid turned with impeccable grace and led them through the main corridor of the tea house. The floor was polished marble, subtly edged with floral patterns that shimmered faintly underfoot. Paintings of mountain landscapes and abstract magical sigils lined the walls. They were not merely decorative, there was real magic at work here, and Roland could sense it. His gaze remained fixed on the screen. He could already tell that some of their earlier pursuers had infiltrated the tea house and were now hidden on the ground floor. Their clothes had changed, and their faces were visible. They blended in as customers, though none of them posed as staff. The enchantments present served several functions, but none were harmful. They controlled the temperature, softened sounds, and adjusted the lighting. Clearly, they were meant to enhance the atmosphere rather than to harm anyone inside. There was a notable absence of armored guards, suggesting that the people here were confident that few would dare to cause trouble. "This room should suit your needs, my lord," the maid said, bowing once more. "Your server will arrive shortly. Please ring the bell if you require anything else." Their private room was on the second floor, though 2 additional floors rose above them. Those were likely reserved for only the highest nobility. Arthur nodded at the woman, and Mary placed a gold coin in the other maid's hand. She showed no reaction. Generosity was customary here, and they had already set aside a considerable amount of money for their travels. Once she was gone and the door clicked softly shut behind her, Roland moved first. He placed a small coin-sized plate in the center of the table. It blinked twice, then emitted a silent pulse. "The room's clean, you can talk freely now." Mary stood near the window, casually watching the street below. Gareth and Warren stayed by the door, ears alert and eyes sharp. Several closed rooms lined the main corridor, each guarded by heavily armored soldiers who looked in their direction while protecting their own lords. Arthur sat cross-legged beside the table, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from the porcelain tea set that had already been arranged. This place seems so peaceful. He turned to look out the window, where children were playing. The area around them appeared calm, and a few of the younger ones ran about freely without a care in the world. It was a sharp contrast to the rest of Dragness Island, where criminals often ran unchecked. This neighborhood clearly belonged to the wealthiest of the wealthy, a sanctuary made possible only by the towering castle walls and the thousands of soldiers stationed outside. "There is a price for peace like this," Arthur responded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Roland didn't press him for an explanation, as he could already imagine what Arthur meant. Although the castle felt relatively safe and peaceful, that did not mean the people beyond its walls were truly free. Everyone was separated into groups and bound by strict laws. Those who belonged to prestigious families were allowed to stay here, but the moment their status declined, they would be cast out and replaced. "I propose we have some of that tea. Like it or not, we still have to stay here for nearly 2 days before the assembly begins." "You're right, my friend. I'm sorry for bringing down the mood. How about we order something? Is anyone hungry?" Once Roland suggested having tea, the atmosphere shifted. The place was called a tea house, but it functioned more like a restaurant. If they wished, they could even request entertainment and have someone sing or play music for them. For a few hours, they remained there, drinking tea and eating sweet pastries, most of which ended up in Mary's hands. "Let's go. We've stayed long enough without incident. If nothing else, they're patient. Arthur made his comment after they had spent more than 2 hours there. They had been resting and chatting while keeping an eye on the people who were trying to spy on them. Mary stretched her arms and stood, brushing the last crumbs of a glazed pastry from her maid uniform. They left a few golden coins on the table and began to leave. Once they were gone, someone would come in to clean up after them. The group moved in an orderly line, with Roland leading and the others positioned to guard Arthur from every direction. As they left the private chamber, the same maid who had escorted them earlier offered a graceful bow. Just as they were about to reach the stairs leading downward, Roland raised his hand, signaling them to stop. 4 figures appeared and blocked the passage from all directions. They were armored knights, and based on the design of their armor, they belonged to the Valyrian household. A distant relative? But why would they bring so many people with them? Roland could tell these 4 were not the only knights present. He had already noticed movement and voices coming from the floor below and had assumed that a high-ranking noble had arrived with permission to bring extra guards. However, the Valyrian crest on the armor suggested something more troubling. Footsteps echoed from the stairwell as someone began to ascend. The first figure to appear was a noble woman with her face concealed behind a violet veil. Even though her face was covered, it was obvious she was a rare beauty. Her gown, woven with silver thread, shimmered as she ascended the steps and clung tightly to her figure. Her waist was narrow, accentuating her hourglass shape. Her hair seemed almost unnatural, nearly the same color as the veil she wore, long and loose. While he paid little attention to her, Gareth and Morian were completely stunned and only snapped out of it when Mary kicked one of them in the shin. But Roland and Arthur were focused on someone else. Their attention was drawn to the man beside her. He was tall, with broad shoulders wrapped in dark noble attire. His hair, a deep shade of crimson, was tied neatly at the back with a silver band, and a well-groomed beard framed his angular jaw. Though he appeared to be engaged in conversation with the woman, his gaze briefly shifted, and he paused mid-step. Why is this man here? Roland recognized him instantly. He had seen portraits and heard enough descriptions to be sure. He didn't need to look at Arthur for confirmation. The sudden spike in his heartbeat told him everything. This was no ordinary noble. This was one of the Valyrian siblings. Why are you here? Who let you in? The man just stopped and instantly frowned when he looked in Arthur's direction. It was clear that Arthur was momentarily baffled by the encounter. Although he had prepared himself to face his brothers, that did not make it any easier. A scowl formed on the man's face as he grew visibly displeased with Arthur's silence. Instead of repeating the question, he turned to one of his knights. The armored man seemed to understand his lord's intent and stepped forward, likely preparing to grab Arthur and demand a clear answer. What are you doing? I can't move, my lord. To everyone's surprise, something strange occurred. The knight managed only 2 steps before becoming rooted in place. Roland had reacted swiftly, using his runic magic to restrain him. To most observers, it appeared as though he had been stopped by an invisible force, but a mage would have seen the swirling threads of mana wrapping around him and holding him still. Don't approach Lord Valyrian without his permission. His wristbands began to glow as he raised his hand in a silent display of power. He made no attempt to conceal his strength, choosing instead to demonstrate that he was not afraid to retaliate against what he perceived as an imminent threat. Mary stepped closer to Arthur while Gareth and Morian moved forward, their hands hovering near their weapons. Lord Valyrian? Is that what you call yourself now, bastard? The older man with crimson hair shouted the insult loudly enough for everyone to hear. Nobles peeked from their private rooms, drawn by the commotion in the corridor. Servants froze mid-step, and hushed whispers spread across the hall. Arthur's face lost its color at the insult, but he didn't waver. He stood firm and responded without hesitation. At least this bastard didn't lose an entire city to a cult's corruption. Roland was genuinely surprised. Arthur was usually calm and composed in situations like this. The man standing before them was Ivan Valyrian, the 3rd oldest brother and the overseer of Rika. That was the very city where Roland had gone to upgrade his adventurer credentials and where the cult had launched its devastating attack. Now that Ivan had arrived at the same time as Arthur, it was clear that his reputation had deteriorated even more than anyone had expected. You damn bastard, you dare talk back to me? Have you lost your mind? The man was clearly taken aback by the sudden defiance his younger brother was showing. Arthur stood there with a blank expression, concealing all emotion as if he were completely unaffected. Ivan, on the other hand, was a mess. He was becoming emotional and enraged, something the other nobles around them were quick to notice. "Dear? Why have we stopped?" Before the confrontation between the two brothers could escalate, a woman's voice interrupted. It was sweet and sensual, coming from the lady standing beside Ivan. The moment she spoke, it was as if a spell had been cast over him. He immediately straightened his posture and turned to face her. "It's nothing, my love. Just an annoying fly." "Then let us just ignore this fly and go upstairs, not like it can follow us there." "Indeed, my love, you are right." The man burst out laughing when he realized that Arthur had only been granted access to the second floor of the establishment and was not allowed any higher. Roland's eyes narrowed as Ivan's laughter echoed through the corridor. He did not react, choosing instead to focus on the woman standing beside Ivan. He tried to examine her status, but she was protected by sophisticated enchantments that prevented him from seeing anything at this distance. There was something unsettling about how effortlessly she had taken control of the noble. Roland wondered if he was simply overthinking it, though a part of him remained uneasy. Her timely intervention had defused the situation, and Ivan, clearly satisfied, smirked and walked upstairs. His posture and pace made it obvious he wanted to assert his superiority over Arthur. Arthur, to his credit, remained silent. He watched without a word as Ivan ascended the stairs, the woman on his arm and the knights marching in step behind them. Roland snapped his fingers, releasing the restrained knight. The man stumbled slightly before regaining his balance, offering no sign of resistance. Even Ivan seemed to understand that pushing further would attract the wrong kind of attention. Roland waited until the sound of their footsteps faded beyond the second flight of stairs before finally stepping aside to let Arthur descend. There were too many eyes in the building for them to speak freely about the situation, but it seemed Arthur's position was not as dire as they had originally believed. His older brother's status seemed to have diminished while his rose. Still, there was a chance that Ivan would come looking for trouble, and they needed to be ready. "Well, that was unexpected. Sorry, without my golems, it's hard to predict who might be nearby." Roland spoke while glancing at the tea house in the distance. He could tell that the people they had just encountered had gone up to the third floor and were probably discussing the same incident. "Oh no, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Even I didn't expect my older brother to get here this quickly." Arthur and Roland walked through the area, both deep in thought about what had just happened. It seemed that Ivan had arrived not long after they did. Roland could confirm this by examining the residual energy left behind by the teleportation gate used by Ivan and his knights. His mana senses allowed him to gauge the residue's deterioration, which declined at a predictable rate. Based on this, he estimated that Ivan had arrived roughly an hour after they did, a detail that carried its own importance. "I suppose this is a good thing, and perhaps an opportunity." Roland's voice trailed off as he looked through his visor. The people who had been following them were still present, but to his surprise, some had stayed behind at the tea house. He couldn't be certain yet, but there was a chance they were keeping an eye on Ivan Valerian as well. This Valerian son had a reputation for being a bit of a brute, and his larger-than-average build, combined with his earlier emotional outburst, only confirmed it. An opportunity for what? Arthur glanced at Roland, unsure what he meant. "For you to take his position. He's in a vulnerable state right now. He suffered heavy losses during that cultist attack and hasn't had time to recover." "I see. That might be true." While they hadn't been sure when they first arrived, it now seemed that Ivan's status was slipping while Arthur's was beginning to rise. The timing of the gate transfer confirmed it. Normally, if Ivan's standing were higher, he would have arrived the following day. Although he was the third son, it now appeared that even the fourth son, Tybalt Valerian, had surpassed him. Arthur was still ranked last, but there was a real possibility he could overtake Ivan and claim the fourth position. "Perhaps this gathering was meant to be a test of some sort for you and the others." "I wouldn't be so sure about that. My father doesn't usually go out of his way to do such things," Arthur replied. He implied that Duke Alexander took a more hands-off approach to raising his children and would not orchestrate artificial battlegrounds for them to earn merit. Roland, however, remained unconvinced. The entire culling event felt like one of those carefully arranged trials, and after examining the underground tunnels, he was certain it had been manufactured to some degree, though not by the Duke. That part was the most worrisome of all, and he still wasn't sure whether he should bring it up with the Duke. Arthur already knew about his examination and was planning to use the discovery to earn favor with his father, but neither of them knew the right moment to reveal it. For now, the tunnels beneath the island remained a secret known only to them, a secret that could prove highly profitable and greatly strengthen their cause. He had already constructed one teleportation gate to the super dungeon without anyone noticing, and an underground railway system was now a real possibility. Working with Sebastian, he had completed the necessary measurements, and thanks to the size of the tunnels and the mono-reinforced walls, the structure was stable enough to proceed. Their only real concern was the group involved in the culling. Those individuals also knew about the tunnels and could become a threat later on. Well, shall we take things slowly? Let's get through these 2 days without any more incidents. Arthur spoke as they walked through the central district of the castle grounds. They visited several places, including an alchemical perfumery known for its scents infused with subtle enchantments. The shop was fascinating and filled with noble women browsing the displays. It was part of a larger section that featured boutiques and high-end clothing stores. Even from the outside, the prices appeared astronomical, making it clear that only the wealthiest could afford to shop there. Afterward, they came across a magical store unlike those found in Albrook or other cities. In the places they came from, shops typically sold enchantments designed for combat or monster hunting. Here, however, the magic was tailored to elevate the lifestyle of nobility. The stores had grand names like the Arcane Whispering Silk. Inside, they found floating fabrics and dresses that changed color and pattern according to the customer's wishes. Some pieces even grew or shrank to better fit the wearer's body shape, a fascinating display that actually caught Roland's attention. He was skilled in working with metal and creating various alloys, but he had never explored the world of magical threads in much detail. Interested? Should we take a few samples back home? Arthur spoke up when he noticed Roland silently staring. Even though Roland wore a helmet, Arthur had long since learned how to read his moods. If something captured his attention, he would fix his gaze on it without saying a word, and Arthur had become familiar with that subtle habit. We could probably find similar threads through other channels at half the cost. Haha, so that's what you were worried about. Although Roland had been earning a considerable amount of money recently, he still disliked unnecessary spending. Arthur, on the other hand, saw this as the perfect opportunity to indulge. It was true that displaying their wealth in such prestigious locations could help spread favorable rumors. If people believed they could afford to shop in high-end boutiques, their reputations would naturally grow. How may we serve you, my lord? I wish to buy a suit and perhaps something for my knight here, maybe some new stylish boots or a new cape to fit the occasion. Arthur smiled and gestured toward a surprised Roland. A man resembling a butler approached and began examining them from every angle, as if measuring them with his eyes alone. I understand. I believe I have just the thing for both of you. Please follow me. Roland wasn't too pleased with this turn of events, but standing in the open where people were watching them, he couldn't refuse Arthur's order. The young noble had a playful look on his face, and soon Roland was forced to choose a new cape for himself, one made from shape-shifting threads. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, the group emerged from the shopping district with their arms full of elegantly wrapped parcels. Roland's new cape shimmered subtly in the fading light, shifting between deep navy and a faint emerald depending on the angle. He still looked slightly uncomfortable, especially with Arthur grinning triumphantly beside him. See? You almost look fashionable now. A high knight commander doesn't need to look fashionable. That's where you're wrong, my friend. A knight's appearance reflects on their master, and you wouldn't want to make a duke's son look bad, would you? Calling yourself a duke's son now? What happened to being proud of being a bastard? Roland felt mildly irritated after the hours they had spent wandering through shops. Arthur had bought a large quantity of clothes and magical trinkets, at least giving something to everyone in the group. Mary received a bracelet, and all the knights were given new capes, with his own design to be more elaborate to emphasize his higher rank. That's just how we nobles are. We can't be trusted, my friend. Yeah, I know, don't remind me. Roland wanted to roll his eyes at the response. Although they spoke freely, he had been using magic to block their voices from being overheard. Speaking to a duke's son so casually could raise suspicion, but they could always claim they were joking and that Arthur had ordered everything. So, can we visit some other shops now? Arthur asked, but Roland shook his head. The sun is setting. We should head back for now. Tomorrow, let's analyze your other brothers. Agreed. Arthur replied. They had already decided on their plan for the next day. They now knew the locations of all the teleportation gates and where each of Arthur's 3 brothers would be arriving. The best approach would be to blend in with the nobles who would be welcoming them and observe their abilities from a safe distance. Welcome back, my lord. Would you like dinner to be served? Yes, that would be splendid. When they returned, they were greeted by the temporary servants assigned to them. The meal was impressive, but they did not begin eating until Mary had finished checking for potential toxins. Only then did they settle in to enjoy it. Arthur took his place at the head of the table with the composed demeanor of someone long accustomed to pretending he belonged in such a seat. Roland sat nearby, his eyes occasionally sweeping the room. They were still under surveillance from the outside, but he had ensured that their conversation could not be overheard. So, what did you think of Ivan's companion? His companion? The veiled lady? Was there something unusual? As they ate, Roland finally brought up the woman who had accompanied the third brother. Although her face was hidden, that did little to fool someone with Roland's skills or any other Tier 3 class holder. She was undeniably beautiful, that much was certain, but there was something about her that made him uneasy, something he couldn't quite define. Did she leave such an impression? Don't worry, my friend. Your secret is safe with me. Secret? Yes, yes. I won't tell your wife. Arthur laughed again, and Roland began to wonder if he was the only one taking the situation seriously. Mary simply shook her head as though the joking annoyed her, though she didn't seem to notice anything particularly troubling. Maybe I'm just overthinking this. What truly unsettled him were the layers of status concealment spells cast on the woman. It would take time for him to decipher them, and even then, despite his deep research into such magic, he had little confidence in breaking through. It was clear she was hiding something. But as the presumed spouse of Yvonne Valerian, Roland knew he would have no opportunity to approach her and find out what it was. The feeling of uncertainty lingered even after the large dinner. Although the food was well prepared and he had little to criticize, he still believed his wife was the better cook. Eventually, the servants cleared the table and left, and it was time for them to settle in for the night. Roland hoped the next 3 days would pass without incident, but things rarely unfolded according to his wishes. This visit would likely be no exception. The clouds covered the entire sky, hiding every star from view. In the choking darkness, they came. A ripple in the air near Arthur's balcony was the only warning, too faint for any ordinary guard to notice. The shimmer vanished as 5 shadowy figures stepped from the void, cloaked in smoke and silence. Their faces were hidden behind masks with narrow slits for eyes, and their breaths were muffled by some kind of enchantment. One of the assassins raised his dagger and traced a small circle on the window. A perfectly round hole appeared. He reached for a small vial on his belt, removed the cork with a soft click, and tossed the container into Arthur's chambers. Violet smoke burst from it, spreading quickly across the floor. The sleeping enchantment filled the room in moments, drifting fast and low. Even mages with active mana barriers would succumb to its effects. The leader gave a quick hand signal, and they moved as one. The door opened without resistance. They slipped inside like wraiths, spreading into a wide formation. One approached the bed first, though he carried no weapon. In his hands were a rope and a large sack marked with enchantments. He nodded to the man beside him as they confirmed their target seemed to be sleeping under the covers. But when the blanket was pulled back, what they found was anything but expected. The assassin had no time to react. A wooden arm shot up and struck him across the face, knocking him into a nearby chair. The figure beneath the sheets was revealed, not a man and not even alive. It was a wooden puppet, crafted in the likeness of the noble who was supposed to be sleeping there. It was not what they expected. The creature sprang forward and hurled itself at them. It was fast, but not fast enough. The leader reacted quickly, drawing his dagger and coating it in an aura-like energy. Unlike the usual crimson hue, this one glowed with a deep violet light. The wooden monster lunged with a clumsy punch. The assassin dodged easily and countered with a rapid series of precise strikes, slicing the creature apart. The entire exchange was silent. They all stared at the fallen foe, but more threats were already closing in. It was clear now that they had walked into a trap. Escape was likely their best option. "Where do you think you're going?" A voice echoed from the balcony they had entered through. There stood a woman holding one of their team members in a single hand. It was the lookout they had stationed below. He hung limp in her grasp, blood pouring from a deep wound in his throat. He was clearly dead. The remaining assassins drew their daggers, ready to engage. As they moved, a strange magnetic force swept through the room and slammed them to the ground. From the far corner, a figure stepped forward. He wore shining knightly armor and radiated powerful magic. The assassins lay stunned. It was now clear that this man was Wayland, the High Knight commander from Albrook. He had been in the room all along. They had known he possessed magical abilities, but this display went far beyond anything they had anticipated. Things looked grim, but they were not ready to give up. The leader managed to resist the magical binding to some extent and moved his hand toward an object resembling a thorn-covered medallion. He pricked his finger, letting blood drip into the artifact. The tool responded immediately, glowing with a strange light. In an instant, the crushing magical pressure disappeared. The spell had been cancelled. Kill them both. Leave no witnesses. The item was a rare artifact that nullified all mana in the area and corroded any new spells cast nearby. It was a perfect countermeasure against mages. 2 of the assassins lunged at the woman by the balcony while the other 3 charged at the armored man standing before them. Their blades shimmered with deep violet energy, casting a sharp glow across the entire room. As Tier 3 class holders, their true power could no longer be concealed. With superior numbers and overwhelming force, they were confident in victory. The leader remained silent as he watched his 2 allies launch their attack. He prepared to finish off the man known as Wayland. Although Wayland was a mage, his physical strength surpassed that of many knight commanders. He was not someone to underestimate, but they did not believe he would pose a problem. At this range and without the use of spells, that should have been impossible. A violet blade moved toward his throat and another toward his heart, but just as they were about to connect, a magical reaction erupted. Instead of striking flesh, the weapons coated in aura were repelled by a thick veil of mana. The situation grew worse as the assassination techniques triggered a backlash, causing their wrists to bleed and their bones to crack under the force of the rebound. No sound escaped the room, but the leader sensed that something had gone wrong. He looked to the side where his other 2 allies had jumped, only to see them struggling to land a single strike against the woman. Wielding 2 blades of her own, she countered every attack with perfect precision, and wounds had already begun to appear on their bodies. The magic that was supposed to be disabled had started to re-emerge. It surged back rapidly, as if the mage they were fighting had already analyzed the enchanted item and rendered it useless within seconds. The pressure of magic settled on him again, heavier than before. Now, instead of thinking about victory or escape, the leader began to wonder if he would leave this place alive.